Well, good evening and welcome back once again to Bite by Bite, a journey through the gift of living in the divine will. I'm Larry Leopold, and I'm a Carmelite, and I'm also a spiritual director. So, as we talk about these aspects, these little bits of the divine will, we try to break it out in a way of understanding it and living it. How do I apply this in my life? Now, that'll be a challenge tonight because we are taking on the topic of the divine perspective that God has in the divine will, which is beyond time and space. And so let's explore that together for a moment if we could. So many times we hear about uh, how is the divine will different from things like the Carmelite spirituality, which I love so much. We know that in the height of the Carmelite spirituality comes spiritual marriage, the highest state of union with God, where the soul and God are conformed so much that they become one. Very similar language to what we say in the divine will. And so the graces that got them there, right, comes from the Holy Spirit. And so the graces that come through the divine will come through the Holy Spirit. They both are Trinitarian graces, right? But there are significant differences that the divine will has that we would like to explore, and how those are coming through this perspective that God has, a perspective that changes how we look at things, because more and more we want to look at things from God's perspective. As we move into his will, we want to think with his will, speak in his will, and love his will, so much so that we possess it as if it were our own. Well, when we shift and understand that his will does not exist the way we think, how we exist, for we are creatures, and that creation was made in time and space by that great fiat of God the Father, the let there be light, right? The fiat lux. I call it the great fiat, all right? And so in that love moment where bursting love came forth from the Trinity, who had so much love they couldn't contain it, that they gave birth to all of creation. They created time in the process. All right, so that is the perspective that God has over all of us, a view beyond time, a view from eternity, where heaven is, where God dwells, right? With the beatific vision, the saints and all the angels. They're all in that eternity, which the divine will is trying to bring us into. So I thought we would begin by exploring that, first of all, fiat lux of God the Father. That when he created us, he created this bubble that we see as our world. Of course, it's so vast that we knew not the edges of it as we explore space. It seems to go on infinitely, although we know that it is created and therefore finite. But we know too that we exist in this thing called time, and God does not. Now, for us to think outside of the box of time takes a bit of doing. And tonight I thought, let's give that a shot. Let's take a moment and see if we can understand a little bit how God, in his perspective, is a wider view and in his will. And that as we are entering into his will, we need to understand and, in a sense, share that perspective as best we can as creatures. And that's a limit. All right, when God first said that fiat, he created everything in one explosive moment of love. All of creation came into existence, as we know, even from physics. All right, and in that explosion of creation was also created time and space. All right, and so as we live in time and space, we have to try and imagine what God, in his view, beyond time and space, how can he interact with us, right? For us, we live in a timeline, right? Sequences of one thing following another. When God said his eternal fiat that created time, created out of light all of that is, he also created what he called his volition, which was his will moving in time. So his volition is an active word. His will is what is the heart and the essence of God, right? His very nature. And so there are two different aspects, one that is beyond time and one that we experience along in our time. So volition, that Father Brown would teach, was exemplified by that timeline from the beginning of time until the end of time. And within that, we live from moment to moment. We know that God sustains us at every moment in his created love, right? In his uncreated love. He is always holding us and maintaining us, or else we wouldn't exist. The moment wouldn't exist. And as Father Brown would point out, each of those moments are just that, a moment. What in the cloud of unknowing would be called an atom of a second, all right? In other words, we can't even measure how quick a moment is, or how many billions of moments gone on just as I'm talking about it. And so if we have that view, which he says is kind of like 35 millimeter film, frames that have run so quickly that they give the illusion of motion, right? A continuous movie, right? And so if we can understand that these moments in our life are individual segments that God has sustained, each one of them, right? And that he acts in that love of sustaining each moment of our time. That as his will touches this timeline of his volition, it creates a point in time, a moment, all right? Now, if you can get that picture in your head, all right, of all these slices intersecting the line of volition, which is the timeline. Every place that they intersect creates a point, a dot, and that is how we experience the present moment for us, right? We are only having the present moment. That's all that is real for us, right? The past is gone. The future has not occurred. And so as we, in our spirituality, try not to dwell on the past or the future, but we meet God in the present moment. And so it is in the divine will that as we walk through our day, we need to know that he is present in the moment with us. This is what Brother Lawrence would call living in the presence of God in the present moment. And it's a gift, hence the word present. But beyond that, at that point of our day, which might be just looking at our watch to see what time it is, in that moment of looking, in that moment, things happen, and they always do. You know, as we read in the Book of Heaven, if you were to look up, every time Luisa said, at that moment, that's when she would encounter God. That's when he would come forth from within her. That's when she experienced the divine presence at that moment. And 110 times, she's relating how that happened in the Book of Heaven. So at that moment becomes very important for us to be aware and conscious that we are in a moment, and that moment has the potentiality of becoming a divine act with all the divine graces and uncreated love that Jesus can create in that divine moment, in that divine act. So we have to learn how to be awake and attentive to those moments that present themselves throughout our day, because every one of them can be unwrapped into the eternal now where God dwells, right? So as we say, when God in his will intersects on the line of time called his volition, that becomes an entrance point for us to do our divine act intention, where we renounce our human will and create the desire to make a divine act with Jesus. We're awake and aware, we're conscious and intending that this become an act that Jesus, who is present in his real life within us, would take what we're doing and turn it from a human act into his own act, because he's divine, and therefore the act becomes divine by him doing it. We have the easy part. All we have to do is want it. He does all the work. But as he's doing that work, and as we intend to make this a divine act, at that moment, we enter the eternal now with him. All right? We go to that point on the timeline of volition and enter his will into the eternal now, so that we are now in eternity as you're looking at your watch. Okay? And with our intentionality, Jesus is turning that into a divine grace, which he will diffuse to everyone throughout creation, in the past, in the present, and the future, and take all the love that it gleans from their suspended acts to return that as a gift, a requital of love to God the Father for all the love he poured into creation. We've heard this, right? And we may, know the words, but I thought tonight perhaps we could do something a little more and explore what this realm of the eternal now is in the eternal divine will. And so we have a couple passages that we'll be going through and hopefully unpacking those parts that might sound a little misty. All right. And our first one comes from April 8th in the Book of Heaven, 1918, living united with Jesus, and how it's different from living in the divine will. And so Louise is telling us how she returned to the point about living in the divine will. And she had been told that it was like living in the state of union with God. And you may perhaps have someone say that to you, equating it with our old way of spirituality. And Jesus, at that moment, on coming into her, said, "My daughter, there is a great difference between living united with me and living in my will." And as he was saying this, he stretched forth his arms toward me and told me, "Come into my will with me, even for one instant, and you will see the great difference." And I found myself, says Luisa, my little Adam in Jesus was swimming in the eternal volition. All right. So here now, in the eternal volition is the intersection of his will and volition. All right. And since this volition, this eternal volition, it is one single act of divine, which contains all acts together. Now imagine all the acts from the past, the present, and the future. Luisa says, I, being in the eternal volition, took part in that single act that contains all acts as much as is possible for a creature. I also took part in the acts which do not exist and yet must yet exist until the end of centuries, until God be God. All right, so there you have, again, how the soul, being drawn into this eternal now, is drawn into an utterly different dimension beyond time and space, right? Beyond the twilight zone, into the divine will zone. All right, now just Blessed Jesus told Luisa now, have you seen what it is to live in my will? It is to disappear. It is to enter the sphere of eternity. It is to penetrate into the all-seeingness of the eternal one, like the graphic we have for this show. How God, in this God eye, sees everything and sees it all as one. It takes us into the uncreated mind, the very mind of the Godhead, and to take part in everything as much as it is possible for a soul to do, right? And so with that, it is in each act, each divine act, that we do this. This is what happens. Now, how much we're aware of it happening is also dependent on how much we've journeyed to ditch the human will that's been damaged, and only to live for the divine will, and by degrees grow more and more in all the qualities of God himself, until we are conformed and one with him, as in the divine marriage, as in the spiritual marriage. So when we are in this place, in the divine will, all right, in this eternal now, what happens to us is we are extending ourselves to everyone without exhaustion. We're able to do that we can enclose within ourselves everyone. And it doesn't wear you out, because the will that is animating us at this point is divine, not our own, right? And it is the sanctity not yet known. This is new, right? But he's making it known, he says, which will place the last ornament, most beautiful one, the most refulgent among all the sanctities. And it'll be the crown and the fulfillment of all sanctities. This is just a taste, if you wish, of what that is to live in that eternal now, all right? But there's more than that, all right? And I thought, okay, that's fine. We get a sense that it's big. It's really, really big, all right? And it's not like anything that we can taste or understand. How is it that we're able to be in a place where the past, the present, and the future are all now, right? I saw a wonderful thing in Elijah's Cloak where he narrates that John Vianney, the Curé of Ars, had this ability to move through time, right? As did Padre Pio. And both of them had access to people in the past, or to things that had not yet been revealed to them through individuals. So were they bilocating into their soul? Were they reading their soul? Or was this also something that possibly the soul, that individual in confession, when he told him his sins, right? The Curé of Ars remembered them from before, when he was in this, whatever, ability to be in this moment, that he can remember the future. Just as Padre Pio talks about how easy it is for him to go into the past when his uncle died, to be with him at his bedside 25 years ago. So let's read a little bit about that, and how Jesus has eternity at his disposal and wants to give you facility to that. How the soul in the divine will can take eternity within her own power. How God loses nothing because he's perfect in the loving. So Luisa's telling us she was following the divine will in her acts, in its acts, in everything. It had done everything that it had done in the order of all creation, from the beginning of the world up to the present. But while Luisa was doing this, she thought to herself, well, wait a minute. What is past is not in my power. Therefore, it seems like a waste of time to me to go on tracing what's already passed by. A normal thought. But at that moment, my sweet Jesus moved in my interior, telling me, he said, my daughter, for one who does my will and lives in it, all times and all places are hers. Did you hear that? that if you are living in the divine will, all times, all places, everywhere, and every when are yours. My supreme will loses nothing of what it does, and with its unique power, it does the act, and it preserves the act within itself, intact and beautiful, just as it did it, right? Because it's the divine will who is doing these divine acts within you, right? Jesus and the divine will, one. And so one who lives in my supreme will finds in this will, in the God's will, the order of all its acts, as if we were doing them, as if the divine will were doing them at that very moment, that very instant. And the soul, uniting itself with the divine will, does what my volition is doing, right? So this volition, which is the one act, the one continuous creative act, for instance, of the fiat of creation, it's still in act. It hasn't changed. It's ongoing in the eternal now. Our acts, we do them and they're done, but not in the eternal now. And so this volition is the continuing of the fiat of creation. It's the continuing of the fiat of redemption. And that's why we find Jesus in his agony in the hours of the passion as an ongoing present thing for us in the divine will. So here's what Jesus has to say about it. And I think you're going to love this. He said, this is all the delight, the satisfaction, and the glory of my will, that while its acts are eternal, okay, and that's not a big sweat. We know God's acts are eternal because he's eternal. But here, us, the littleness of you and I, the creatures who live in this divine will, can take eternity in her power and finding the acts of her creator as though in act and being done. All right. So for us, it doesn't matter when we enter the eternal now, whether we're doing the act we are intending in the moment. But what we find is all the acts that God has done are right there as though they're now. We're in that now. We're not in our present moment. We're in his present moment, which is always in act, always happening, one act. And so when the soul finds these acts, right, just like the life of Jesus and his humanity on earth, the soul repeats with him that act because it's right there, right in front of us. She loves, she glorifies the endlessness of the acts of the one who created her, all right? And how hard is that not? I mean, really, we are now experiencing this trip through time, right, in God's endless universe, in this heaven, where the past, the present, and the future are all right there in front of you. And so what happens, Jesus says now, is a contest of wills takes place. A contest of love and of glory is formed between them. And it's a play, it's a game contest of who can love each other more, who can glorify each other more. And it goes back and forth, which is astounding that God would play such a game with us, his little nothings with a tendency toward evil, as Luisa says. Therefore, Jesus says that the times of creation are at our disposal, as well as the place of the terrestrial Eden. In other words, the ability to go to the Garden of Eden, because it's in time and was a place. We have the ability in the eternal now to bilocate there. She has the times of my incarnation, of my passion, as we said, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Calvary. None of those are far from us in the divine will. It's like coming in the middle of the show for us to be there. Past, distance, they don't exist for us. But everything is present and near. So even more, you must know that my will gives unity of everything to the soul. And just as my will, being one, does everything in the same way, the soul who possesses that divine unity in the divine will, we are able to enclose within ourselves the thoughts of everyone, the works, the steps, the heartbeats of all, as if they were all one already, all alone, in such a way that my will finds in her all generations within you, and the single acts of each one within you, just as it finds them within itself, the divine will. When you enter into the divine will and become one with it, everything in the divine will is in you too, and you are in the divine will. It's an amazing puzzle, isn't it? An enigma wrapped in a puzzle, right? Surrounded by mystery. And this is the divine will and the experience that God has in seeing all that's going on, so that his perspective is to become our perspective. And in times like these right now, where we see things and the wickedness of the time and the giving of this gift for times like this, that we are especially called to have God's perspective in these times and to see how he sees, not how we want things to be. Right? And if we allow his will to become ours, to possess it as our own, then he will impart to us his own heart. So when chastisements become necessary, lest the souls be lost, and there's nothing more sorrowful, more painful for God and the divine will than to lose a soul, a single soul, then we are to, with him, share that same perspective, that same longing for souls that need to be saved at any cost. And he only chastises those whom he loves. So, the divine perspective, it's much bigger than ours. But as you read the knowledges in the divine will and gain that divine perspective, which is God's own attribute, he will impart that within you more and more, so that we, as even praying for our loved ones, have God's own perspective about where they are on the journey, what they need to discover on their own, what they need to do to bump and to find dead ends, right? And to use the brokenness that some of their choices might do to break them open into a metanoia of conversion to God. And so we need to cooperate with God in all these things for our peace and for the grace for the souls that we're praying for, and to be one with God. So with that tiny touch into this immensely divine subject and an immense subject, right? A divine perspective. I hope it shed a little bit of light on what that's like, what it's like inside, and wouldn't you like to go there? Just for a little bit. And so now I'd like to see where you are and what questions this might have brought for you, or what other questions you might have for us tonight. All right. And so, hello, Martha. How are you?
Good. I am very good, Larry. And we do have a question from Double J.
Okay, great. All
And
right.
the question is, was not trans-temporal bilocation only something that came about with Luisa and the gift of the divine will given her?
Yes, it was given to her. And yes, she had a very special mission. And therefore, her experience of it was a unique one. All right. How much we will experience of it is in part of God's will and plan for you and I. A part of it seems to go along with the idea of getting our butts into that fourth degree of living totally uh, conformed to God's will, so that he can then allow us to experience all the adventures that being in that divine will can afford us. Now, Luisa achieved that very young, right? And now, as she shared with us some of the journeys and the visions and the experiences she had, How much of those can we expect to do ourselves? I don't know. But I know that as we avail ourselves to it, as we experience the spiritual marriage with our beloved in this love affair that's begun with you, as you become more intimate with him, get to know him more, and get to fall deeper and deeper into love with him and his will, right, then that relationship that you have will evolve into going steady and perhaps becoming engaged. And it doesn't end with spiritual marriage, just as any marriage doesn't end in marriage. One hopes, right? We hope that it's the beginning of the whole new adventure that a couple have in marriage. And so it is with God. That as we enter into the divine will, that's opening up a new portal into yet deeper mysteries, mysteries that are involving in eternity, because our divine acts are eternal, right? More and more, you're living in eternity in the fourth degree, because it really is like being in heaven while still being alive and without the beatific vision. That's the only thing reserved. So what can happen when you're in heaven? Well, anything. Jesus tells us that nothing is impossible in the divine will. And since Luisa has already experienced them, we know it's possible, right? And so it's even out of the realm of impossible. What remains, the question is, how much have we availed ourselves of letting go of our human will and to be accessible to God, right? Available to him, for him to take us wherever he wants. All we have to do is become like soft wax in his hands, he says. The rest is up to him, except how much we cooperate. So you have this free will. And the stronger your will is, the better, right, to let go of the human will and become one with him so we can find out. And as you find out, I'd like to know. So please email me if you go there. I want to know. All right,
Well, let's
Mark.
piggyback a little bit with Double J because he's asking a second part to this
Go
question.
ahead.
So, did it not exist before her? Bilocation was in existence with the saints of old, but not this?
Yeah, bilocation with Padre Pio, with other saints, we know that they experienced it. And they experienced it not just in the spiritual, which Luisa did, and as far as we know, what we'll be able to do. I don't know if we, like Padre Pio, will be able to go have dinner with Monsignor Esif, as he did, my confessor, whom I asked your prayers for him tonight. I, but he did it physically, didn't he? He was able to manifest himself physically, and others could see him and visit with him, talk to him. Whereas Luisa was doing it spiritually, but in a very strange way. Again, part of her spiritual phenomena was that, as Father Celso relates, when he went over to her little house uh, and saw on her bed a pair of socks all torn up and dirty, and he asked, "Oh, well, aren't these? Don't you give her fresh socks? Why does she have these old beat up socks?" And they let him know that every morning they would put fresh socks on her, and at night, in the next morning, they would be all torn up and beat up. And we can only imagine that Jesus, perhaps as he was taking her on these bilocation journeys through time, that she had on the same pair of socks and they got torn up. You explain that one to me, because I don't know. And so we're entering these mysteries, and how we in fact will experience them remains to be seen. Right. And so the bilocation, yes, it existed before. Bilocation and transtemporal location, not so. All right. And our ability to bilocate at will into hearts of others is a spiritual, again, we desire it and Jesus does it. Right. The ease of that is not what happened with the saints, which many times happen outside of their knowing, willing, right? Their intellect. God just did it, all right? So there are distinctions, all right? But this one is in the divine will unique. So I hope Double J that helps a little bit. Good conversation, though. I look forward to continuing that.
Thank you, Double J, for that. And thank you, Larry, so much for tonight's show. I'm going to leave you with some closing remarks before we say goodnight.
All right. Well, thank you, and good night to you, Martha. All right, and to all of you as we realize that as we end this program in time, all right, that God keeps all these acts, that as we hope we did this in letting go of our human will, so that just listening and being together is a divine act as well, so that the show, our time together, goes for eternity, and Jesus keeps them all as though they were just being done right now. So even though we can go on YouTube and years and look at this again, in the divine will, you can do that for eternity. So every act you do is a legacy, a legacy of love and glory to God, a legacy of love and glory that manifests more joy to all the saints and angels and the souls in purgatory and to God himself. So please try and be awake enough to remember that your current act is possibly that divine act, and the grace that it can do to change all things, to call down heaven back on earth, so that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's all for tonight. So in God's fiat, I say good night and God bless.